This is the forgotten battle where a dying teenage king humiliated one of history's greatest military minds. What you're about to hear isn't just a heroic underdog story. It's a strategic masterclass, a tale of human grit, and a miracle etched into the dusty hills of medieval Palestine. In 1177, Jerusalem was a city of faith, fear, and fragile hope. On the surface, it looked strong. The towers stood proud, pilgrims arrived in waves, and the air smelled of incense and adventure. But under the surface, the Christian kingdom was crumbling. The man on the throne, not a battle-hardened warrior, not a seasoned ruler, just a 16-year-old boy, dying slowly from leprosy. His name was Baldwin IV, and his face was already starting to decay from the disease eating away at his body. Across the desert, a storm was forming. A storm named Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Saladin wasn't just a general. He was the ultimate tactician, a political mastermind, and the Crusader kingdom's worst nightmare. That fall, Saladin gathered an army tens of thousands strong. Cavalry, infantry, archers, baggage trains. He wasn't marching for loot. He was marching for Jerusalem. And here's where it gets crazy. The kingdom was practically defenseless. Why? Because most of the Crusader lords were off playing war in northern Syria. The powerful Count Philip of Flanders had taken half the kingdom's strength with him, chasing glory in places like Haram and Hama. Jerusalem, it was left with a skeleton force, a few hundred knights, some infantry, and a king who couldn't even hold a sword without help. So when news arrived that Saladin was heading north, most people thought it was over. Jerusalem would fall. It was just a matter of time. But Baldwin IV, despite his age, despite his illness, refused to roll over and die. He gathered what little strength he had, climbed on his horse, and rode out of Jerusalem. Let that sink in. The king of Jerusalem, with bones rotting inside his skin, rode into battle against a force 50 times his size. He had just 375 knights, a few thousand foot soldiers, and something even more important, faith. When Baldwin reached the fortress of Ascalon, he did something desperate. He issued the Arrare ban, a rarely used law that forced every able-bodied man to take up arms. It was a sign of pure desperation. Meanwhile, Saladin was moving methodically. He ignored the Templar fortress at Gaza, knowing they were too few to stop him. He pillaged towns like Ramla and Lydda. He didn't rush. He believed Jerusalem would crumble the moment he knocked on the door. And to be honest, he had every reason to believe that. But Saladin made one massive mistake. He underestimated Baldwin. He thought the young king wouldn't dare leave Ascalon. He figured the Crusader army posed no threat, so he didn't even post scouts to keep watch behind him. Big mistake, because Baldwin was already marching again. With him were some of the most fearless knights in the Holy Land. Men like Rallied of Chatillon, a brutal, unrelenting warlord recently released from years in an Aleppo dungeon. Rallied wasn't just eager to fight Saladin. He wanted revenge. Also joining the king were the Knights Templar, led by Grand Master Odo of St. Amand. These were the elite shock troops of the medieval world, disciplined, heavily armed, and ferociously loyal. By November 25th, Baldwin's force had tracked Saladin's scattered army to a hill called Montgisard, near the modern Israeli city of Ramla. Saladin's forces were spread out, busy looting villages and relaxing after days of marching. What they didn't know was that death was galloping straight toward them. Let's pause and understand the numbers. Saladin, 25,000 troops. Baldwin, 375 knights, 3,000 infantry. Odds roughly 8 to 1, maybe worse. But Baldwin had something Saladin didn't. the terrain, the timing, and the will to fight. Montgisard was swampy and narrow. Saladin's troops were split across miles. The Crusaders, by contrast, were compact, focused, and fired up. Before charging into battle, Baldwin asked the Bishop of Bethlehem to bring forward the most sacred relic in their possession, the true cross, believed to be wood from the very cross Christ died on. And what happened next gave every knight goosebumps. Baldwin dismounted, fell to his knees in the mud, and prayed with his arms outstretched to the cross. A teenager, ravaged by disease, pleading for victory. Then he stood, mounted his horse, raised his sword, and shouted, "I am Jerusalem!" And then they charged. It was an armored avalanche. Knights, Templars, infantry, crashing into Saladin's confused lines with thunder. Saladin's army was not ready. Many of his troops were still off looting. Others were sleeping, cooking, or scattered in nearby towns. When the Crusaders hit, it was like a tidal wave slicing through paper. Reynald's knights smashed into the center. The Templars carved through Saladin's elite guard. Baldwin himself led the charge. Yes, the Leper King was in the front lines. Saladin tried to regroup. He rushed to form blocks of cavalry around the hill. But it was too late. The Crusaders had turned the chaos into a massacre. Hundreds of Muslims were cut down. Thousands fled. And in the middle of it all, Saladin himself nearly died. One of his nephews was killed right next to him. Saladin only escaped by jumping on a racing camel and fleeing with a tiny escort. The Crusaders didn't stop. They pursued all night. They hunted down fleeing soldiers, captured huge piles of loot, and took prisoners by the hundreds. Saladin's army, once proud and invincible, was in tatters. He limped back to Egypt, battered by rain and harassed by Bedouins along the way. Of the 25,000 soldiers he had led into the Crusader states, only 1/10 made it back alive. The rest were dead, captured, or missing. It was the most humiliating defeat of Saladin's career. And Jerusalem, it was safe, not because of numbers, not because of walls, but because of a teenage boy with leprosy and a few hundred knights who refused to give up. Let's talk about why this battle matters. First, it shattered Saladin's image of invincibility. Up until that point, the Muslim world viewed him as unstoppable. But at Montgisard, he got sloppy. He got arrogant, and he paid for it. Second, it galvanized Christian morale. Baldwin became a legend. Despite his illness, he ruled for 10 more years and never lost a major battle. And finally, Montgisard was a lesson in strategy. Baldwin used speed, surprise, terrain, and morale to flip the odds. He didn't win because of brute strength. He won because he was smart and ruthless when it mattered most. But here's the tragedy. Baldwin's disease got worse. By his early 20s, he could barely move. He had to be carried around in a litter. His fingers fell off. His vision faded. Yet he kept ruling. He brokered alliances. He built castles. He kept Saladin at bay. But eventually, Baldwin died, and the kingdom fell into chaos. Just a few years later, Saladin returned. This time, there was no Baldwin, and Jerusalem fell. But for that one glorious day in 1177, the impossible happened. 300 knights, a sick king, and a handful of Templars stopped a superpower. And they did it with swords, faith, and fire in their hearts. That's Montgisard. Not just a battle, a miracle. Want more stories like this one? Underdogs, forgotten kings, and wild victories? Then don't miss the next video popping up right now.